So next week begins our actual Christmas series, and today is the last week in our series called Important. So that'll be the last time that we watch that little bumper and just have some time today to focus on the idea of what's important. And today, the idea is the importance of Advent. You and I will be tempted over the next 4 weeks or so to make Christmas about all the things that it isn't really about. Maybe you need to try and have perfect attendance for the next 4 weeks just to sort of keep this Christmas season in balance. We've made it through the worst shopping day of the year, and we just have Cyber Monday now to make it through, and then we're pretty much home free. If we don't make it through Cyber Monday, we're going to end up going into debt to buy the things that basically are going to be in next year's yard sales. So just try and keep that in perspective. If you're following along this morning, on the back of your bulletin is an outline, and I did a bad job of communicating with Leanna, and if you look at the top, there's all the blanks, and then right below are all the answers. So if you're tired from Thanksgiving and need a nap, you already have all the answers. You don't even have to listen today. In the summer of 2004, I had just gotten back from leading worship at a conference in Cincinnati. Jody and I had been married for about 3 years, and I remember walking to the top of the steps that led up to our apartment and seeing a sign on the door that read, "Welcome home, Daddy." Waiting for Asa to be born 9 months later in February just seemed like an eternity. I remember laying in bed and putting my hand on Jody's stomach just to sort of feel for movement, listening for his heartbeat, and putting up with a moody woman. I'm just kidding. She wasn't moody, but I really did enjoy the fact that she would bump the thermostat down so much cooler the whole time that she was pregnant. That was great. Seeing Asa enter the world, though, that was one of the most amazing memories that I have. I wonder this morning, what would happen if we were to see Jesus? Advent is about the preparation for the coming of Christ into the world. It's about, fundamentally, seeing Jesus. But where did this idea come from? Advent really wasn't a thing in the Bible. It kind of happened later. This next bit is some info that I just got off of thegospelcoalition.org to give us some history. It says the earliest dating of Advent is impossible to determine. The start of Easter in Christian history is far more obviously tied to Passover, albeit with different methods for dating, and Christmas came to be associated with the birth of Christ as a result of it falling during the December solstice, which is the darkest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. The coming of the light of the world made a lot of sense in so much darkness. And within a few centuries of church history, both Easter and Christmas took on special meaning due to their use in commemorating the life of Jesus. In the early centuries of the church, Advent almost certainly arose as a result of the fixed dating of Christmas. Once December 25th became Christmas, it was the center of gravity for the latter half of the year, a perfect balance to Easter in the first half. In this way, Advent took on significance the same way Lent did. Both were preparation for more significant seasons on the horizon. By the 4th century, the first written evidence of Advent is found in modern Spain and Europe, and probably the earliest official mention of Advent practices comes as the Council of Saragossa, which met in AD 380, met to answer a Gnostic-inspired movement called Priscillianism. And basically, the heresy held to a really harsh form of dualism, light versus dark, body versus soul, good versus evil. So perhaps the celebration of the incarnation made theological sense as a counterbalance to this heresy. The council wasn't committed to any specific dating of Advent, though, and only suggested that people attend church daily between December 17th and 29th. By the 5th and 6th centuries, more firm dating of the Advent season can be found in historical records, as well as we start to see Advent sermon series begin to happen in the church. Unlike modern Advent ceremonies, most celebrations of Advent in history had a twin focus. The Latin word adventus was the translation of the Greek word parousia, and that's a word that was used for both the coming of Christ in human flesh and his second coming. Advent then always tended to focus on both. For the first 2 weeks of Advent, the church would reflect on the second coming, and disciples would chasten their hearts, confess sins, and spend time hoping for the quick coming of the Lord. The last 2 weeks of Advent then would transition to focus on the first parousia, Christ in the manger. The double meaning of Advent in history signals an important reality in the liturgical calendar. Advent and Christmas are never held as a full reenactment of the life of Christ, but they point to our place between the resurrection and the second coming. Advent and Christmas are not merely about the coming of Jesus, but about everything since the birth of Jesus. So this double meaning that Advent has, in some ways, from Genesis 1, the world was in Advent until the birth of Christ, waiting for him. And then in some ways, this other meaning, we are in a second Advent right now, following Jesus' birth, as we await his return. In the movie Braveheart, William Wallace is a Scottish rebel who leads an uprising against the cruel English ruler, Edward de Longshanks, who wished to inherit the crown of Scotland for himself. When he was a young boy, Wallace's father and brothers, along with many others, lost their lives trying to free Scotland. Once he loses another one of his loved ones, William Wallace begins his long quest to make Scotland free once and for all, along with the assistance of Robert the Bruce. The catalyst for his rebellion is the murder of his wife, Murren. When she's about to be killed and she's looking to the hills, I think that's the worst, most hopeless scene in the history of movie making. And I imagine the nation of Israel around the time of the birth of Jesus, and if it's fair to even call them a nation after all that they've been through at that point, I think they would empathize with her predicament. They had been waiting for deliverance for a long time and had endured horrible things. They were expecting God to show up, but he hadn't. Let's take a quick walk through the history of Israel. In the very beginning, God places Adam and Eve in the garden in perfect harmony, and they screwed it up. They had one rule to follow, and they couldn't do it. But God promised a way back in Genesis 3 and promised that the offspring of Eve would crush the head of the serpent, and that's a prophetic word about Jesus. In the fallout of the Garden of Eden, the first siblings in the Bible narrative have conflict that leads to the first murder. Not long after that, God is ashamed of what humanity has become, and he wipes them out via the flood. And having witnessed everything die on the planet except for what was in the ark, 5 minutes after disembarking, Noah is naked and drunk. A little later, mankind shares one language and they work together. And instead of working for good, they work for pride to build a monument to themselves. This is known in the narrative as the Tower of Babel. So God steps in and confuses their language. In 2091 BC, Abram is called to go to a place God will show him, and he becomes Abraham. Then he has Isaac, who has Jacob, who's the father of the nation of Israel, and they move to Egypt through some pretty intense drama to survive a great famine. In 1600 BC, the Israelites are being oppressed in Egypt, and so Moses is used by God to deliver them. There's great plagues, there's a parted sea, a destroyed army, and then there's a golden calf. In 1000 BC, David kills Goliath, and Israel begins its journey to superpower status in the known world. Terrible kings follow David, and even a divided kingdom happens. Judah and Israel separate. In 586 BC, Jerusalem falls. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon lays siege to it, and there's a horrible famine behind the blockade inside the city. And the king of Judah is bereft of his sons. They're killed right in front of him. He's blinded. He's humiliated and led back to Babylon in chains. But then, in 430 BC, the word of the Lord comes to Malachi and says, "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He'll turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents." And then 400 years later, an angel appears to a young boy and a young girl. And wise men begin a journey following a star to witness the birth of the Savior. So a quick recap of that. Humanity has ideal conditions and they mess it up. They get a blank slate and they go on a bender and forget their clothes. They're delivered from the greatest nation the world had ever seen, and they worship a golden cow. They achieve superpower status, and they're plagued by leadership that becomes tyrannical and oppressive. And they need a hero. They need a savior, but not to save them from an external oppressor. They need someone to save them from themselves. And so do you and I. You know, I love heroes, comics, stories, books, movies, shows. The idea that someone would step into the midst of everything that's wrong to make it right, that's thrilling to me. When everyone else is running away, the hero is running toward. I grew up watching Christopher Reeves as Superman and Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, reading about Bilbo Baggins taking up the One Ring to save Middle-earth, not expecting to return alive. And many of the heroes that I grew up loving were unimpeachable and indestructible. As a kid, I loved the G.I. Joe cartoon and would watch it anytime that I could. It was amazing to watch, though, because these missiles would blow up planes and everyone would always miraculously parachute out in time. If you think about it, G.I. Joe was this elite fighting force, and they had a kill count of 0. So they're not a very effective fighting force. But I think that we need heroes, though, to call us to the good that we're capable of. Have you noticed lately that our heroes are disappearing? Seems like it's vogue to make them weak by giving them flaws like ours, or even worse than ours. We don't measure up, so we rob them of their strength and tear them down to make ourselves feel better. In the actual world, sports figures, politicians, entertainers, we put them on pedestals, and time again, we watch them fall. I guess it's no surprise, since it happens so much and so often in real life, that would start to be reflected in our fiction as well. Either the best heroes fall, or we create heroes that are horribly broken. Think about some of the current examples. Superman was displayed on screen as being filled with self-doubt. Captain America in the comic books turns out to be a bad guy. Iron Man is an alcoholic. And then you have characters like Wolverine and Deadpool, who are the quintessential anti-heroes. They're bad guys that do the right thing because it's convenient. But Jesus, who came as a helpless baby, and who we look forward to during this season of Advent, well, he's immune to all of those charges. We need a hero like Jesus. In Isaiah 53, it says, "He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he'll see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he'll bear their iniquities." My wife asked the kids last week, what was the one thing that they wanted for Thanksgiving that was a non-negotiable? Like, if we don't have this thing to eat for Thanksgiving, it just won't feel the same. I think she had hoped to scale back some of her cooking this year, but when you have a family of 10 plus and you ask every person what their one thing is, and typically people don't agree, well, then you end up basically stuck in the kitchen for 2 days. Luckily, my wife is incredible, and so she met all of those requests and even some extra things. I wonder if we turn that question to this season of the year, though, and ask, what's the one thing for you that if you don't have that thing at Christmas, it just won't feel like Christmas? Growing up in North Carolina, I remember every year for our tree topper, we had what is now this incredibly ratty old angel. I think she started out as white. She's mostly like gray and off-white now. But every year we would put this on top of our tree. And if you go to the store, you can find lots of other tree toppers that are fancy and do all kinds of songs and dances. But to me, this is precious and special. And without this being on my tree back at my mom and dad's house, it wouldn't feel the same. It's a little weird this year because my mom boxed it up and sent it to our family, so that's kind of bittersweet, because we're going to have it on our tree, but it should be on my parents' tree. So that's one of those things that I associate pretty heavily with Christmas. When we moved to Florida, it became increasingly more difficult for me to sort of capture that spirit of Christmas. Growing up again in North Carolina, the change in seasons and the temperature, that would cue me that Christmas was on its way. In college, we would put on this huge sort of musical theater thing every year. It was enormous. It would last for a week, and we'd have a couple of weeks of prep beforehand. There'd be theatrical lighting and wardrobe changes and great holiday-themed food, Christmas carols. All of those things would sort of prepare me and the rest of campus for exams and for Christmas. Then we moved to Florida, and the first Christmas that we celebrated here, we went to the beach in shorts, and we were comfortable. So that was a bit shocking. All the things that seemed to signal Christmas in my mind, they were gone. Seems like lately, too, that we're almost being victimized by Christmas in an odd way. Like me, I'm sure that you've watched as the push to buy things for Christmas creeps farther and farther back, where it almost seems like about Labor Day they start putting the trees out. It's like all of our attention is being pulled away from the manger and focused on material things, and it can feel like it's all out of control. We have a big family, and I enjoy watching my kids, and I often watch them do stuff. I watch them do it with my own eyes, and then I ask them why they did that thing that I just saw them do with my very own eyes. And if you're a parent, you know what the response is. They say, yeah, it's either it wasn't me or I didn't do it. And I'm thinking, I watched you do that not 3 seconds ago. And they get vehement about it too. It's amazing. You and I, though, we have that same problem during this season. If we're feeling frustrated with materialistic streaks that we see in our kids, we don't have to be, but maybe we need to look in their closets. Check and see what kind of toys they have in there that have a layer of dust that they don't play with anymore. Personally, check your Amazon cart. Do you have tons of things in there just waiting to be purchased? You can empty your cart. Look in your closet at all the things that you already have. And do you have more than you could wear in a week? More than you could wear in 2 weeks? Purge. You could do a family service project every year around Christmas. You could do it for someone who you knew could never pay you back, and maybe even try to do it anonymously. While the rest of the world is stocking up on things, make an effort to purge this season, to take your focus away from things. If you're overwhelmed with obligations during this season, the two most powerful letters in the English language are N and O. When we put them together, we can say the word no. So we sometimes need to learn to say the word no. Use the time of Advent to turn the attention of your family back to the manger, back to the incredible gift of Jesus, and make the one thing of Christmas be Jesus and God's gift being at the forefront of your mind. The world is watching the choices that you and I make, and it's a more powerful sermon than we could ever preach with all of the words that we have. I think that we need Advent, this first Advent that we've talked about, with constant advertisements arriving in our mailboxes and all the media that we consume, with Black Friday seeming to start on Tuesday. We need Advent. There's lots of variations of the traditional Advent candles, whether it be wreaths or a candle holder, but usually each of the 4 weeks candles represents a different aspect of the story leading up to Jesus. The first Sunday is usually focused on Jesus' second coming. The second on the preaching of John the Baptist, who was a voice of one calling in the desert, make way for the Lord. Remember that prophecy that we mentioned just a bit ago from the book of Malachi. John the Baptist is referred to by Jesus as a sort of Elijah, that he had to come before Jesus would come and save us. The third Sunday is more on John the Baptist, but it centers on the joy associated with the coming of Jesus. The fourth Sunday regards what happens to Joseph and Mary, so it retells their story. In some of those candle configurations, there's a fifth candle that's lit, and that's lit on Christmas Eve, and it just represents the person of Jesus. These are tactile reminders of eternal, intangible truths. Maybe your family needs one of these. Maybe the most spiritual thing that you could do today would be to leave this service and go buy an Advent candle set that you use for these next 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. The Old Testament has this kind of remembrance in it also. The Shema is found in Deuteronomy 6, and it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." While Advent's a season made by man, it kind of fits in with what we find as a pattern for the people of God. God's grace and God's truth should be remembered by us and should be all around us so that we remember it and pass it on to those around us that we love. In Revelation, the 19th chapter, it says, I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but himself, and he's dressed in a robe dipped in blood. His name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him and riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This is that second appearing of Jesus. Living between these two advents, the appearing of Jesus in the manger, and then the appearing of Jesus as the rider on the white horse at the end of time. So I want to ask the question again, what if we really saw God? What would we change? Advent refers to the baby in the manger and the rider on the white horse. And we really only have the chance to accept the baby in the manger until the rider appears. Then we no longer have a choice because we'll see him for who he is. And every person who ever was or is will acknowledge him as God. The world did see God, did see Jesus in that tiny baby. The world will again when he appears in his glory and all realize that he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When I was in college, a song came out that walked through the books of the Bible and pointed out an aspect of who Jesus was all throughout. And I'd like to read you these lyrics. It says, in Genesis, he's the breath of life. In Exodus, the Passover lamb. In Leviticus, he's our high priest. Numbers, the fire by night. Deuteronomy, he's Moses' voice. In Joshua, he is salvation's choice. Judges, lawgiver. In Ruth, the kinsman redeemer. 1st and 2nd Samuel, our trusted prophet. In Kings and Chronicles, he's sovereign. Ezra, a true and faithful scribe. Nehemiah, he's the rebuilder of broken walls and lives. In Esther, he's Mordecai's courage. In Job, the timeless redeemer. In Psalms, he is our morning song. In Proverbs, wisdom's cry. Ecclesiastes, the time and season. In the Song of Solomon, he is the lover's dream. In Isaiah, he is Prince of Peace. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Lamentations, the cry for Israel. Ezekiel, he's the call from sin. In Daniel, the stranger in the fire. In Hosea, he is forever faithful. In Joel, he's the Spirit's power. In Amos, the arms that carry us. In Obadiah, he's the Lord our Savior. In Jonah, he's the great missionary. In Micah, the promise of peace. In Nahum, he is our strength and our shield. In Habakkuk and Zephaniah, he's pleading for revival. In Haggai, he restores lost heritage. In Zechariah, our fountain. In Malachi, he's the Son of righteousness, rising with healing in his wings. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he is God, man, Messiah. In the book of Acts, he's the fire from heaven. In Romans, he's the grace of God. In Corinthians, the power of love. In Galatians, he's freedom from the curse of sin. Ephesians, our glorious treasure. Philippians, the servant's heart. In Colossians, he's the Godhead Trinity. Thessalonians, our coming King. In Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, he's our mediator and our faithful pastor. In Hebrews, the everlasting covenant. In James, the one who heals the sick. In 1st and 2nd Peter, he's our shepherd. In John and in Jude, he's the lover coming for his bride. In the Revelation, he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I was listening to a sermon podcast this week that was pretty convicting. It said that most of us would lose in a Bible trivia game against demons. Believing in God isn't enough. James tells us that even the demons do that and shudder. They realize who God is and they fear him. Maybe this season we should all make a point to read through the story of his birth each week. Let it be familiar to you, just as familiar as all the other media that we consume. I enjoy the Grinch and Peanuts Christmas stuff and all of those different holiday movies. But sometimes I can know more about them than I know about the story that is really behind the meaning of Christmas. I need that too in my life. You know, when you go to the doctor and you get a flu inoculation, they give you just enough of the actual virus to make you immune to the real thing. And sometimes I think that you and I do that with our relationship with God, with the great story of Jesus. We don't dive into it enough to really understand it or allow it to become a part of us, and as a result, we become immune to the splendor of it. Because of Advent, we have the opportunity to have a relationship with the God of the universe, the God that created everything that is and that loves us. In A Quiet Place, John Krasinski plays Lee Abbott, a father to 3 children at the start of the movie. It's a stereotypical post-apocalyptic setting. We realize pretty soon that something's wrong. People are quietly scavenging, and there aren't very many people even to be seen. We're quickly made aware of monsters that are everywhere and hunt by sound. So to survive, families learn to communicate with sign language. Something happens that creates tension between the father and his daughter, and her mistake cost her younger brother his life. Toward the end of the movie, Lee has been hurt and the children are in danger. As a father, that's the most powerful scene to me that I've ever seen in a movie. If you couldn't read what was written on there, he just stood and signed, "I love you, and I've always loved you," as he sacrificed his life. You know, our world is in the midst of desperate times as well. And 2,000 years ago, God stepped down in the person of Jesus into the middle of our mess, and broken and bloody, he stood on a cross saying, "I love you, and I've always loved you." And he screamed loud enough to get the attention of the devil and death and hell, and he died so that you and I could live. And maybe you need to respond this morning to what God has been doing in your life as we are in between these 2 Advents. As we sing this song, Brandon will be in the back. If you need prayer or if you need to make some sort of a decision, I encourage you to stand up and go stand with him. Let's stand and we'll sing together.